Ode on a Grayson Perry Anne, part 2. So, continuing on with stanza 1, the poet describes these young people flailing their motors through the smoky night. So he's talking about young people driving their cars, but he describes them as flailing, which means it's an agricultural term, and it means to hit very hard when you're harvesting a crop. And therefore he's suggesting that they work their cars really hard. They see it as a profession. There's a couple of things potentially going on there. Firstly, is he suggesting that they don't have a proper job, they just drive their cars? But equally, is he thinking about who gets to say what is valuable? People from the upper classes might suggest that opera is a really valuable pastime, whereas people from the working classes might think that's a complete waste of time, and actually, drifting your car is much more valuable. So again, it's the use of language raises these questions about what we value. And he talks about them creating bedlam on the Queen's Highway. Now, bedlam means chaos, but specifically it means madness. So he's again associating these young people with images to do with negativity, with ill health, with madness, and they're doing that on the Queen's Highway, which is an old-fashioned term for the road. He says that your gaudy invocation, so again we've got the personal pronoun your here, which reminds us that he's directly addressing the vase. And he says that the vase has a gaudy evocation. So we've moved again from vernacular language here, flailing your motor, to Latinate formal language again. And he says that the vase is both gaudy, so overly brightly coloured to make it tasteless, but it evokes things. So it makes you think of this moment trapped in time. And he says that can somehow conjure the scene without inducing fright, as would a Daily Express expose. So he's praising the artist here, he's praising Grayson Perry, saying you can describe these young people and what they're like, but without the kind of right-wing, derogatory way of describing them that the Daily Express would have, because this is a right-wing tabloid paper which often demonises young people or popular culture. And he says that Grayson Perry, in a way, is celebrating them and celebrating popular culture rather than making them out to be something frightening. Notice now that you've got enjambment between all the stanzas. So that, again, I think evokes this connection between past and present, Keats and Turnbull, the Grecian urn and Grayson Perry. And this second stanza here, again, follows this metrical pattern. So you've got a very, very tight construction, but then these interesting, modern, more informal images. And this stanza focuses on sound that's associated with what's on the urn. So it really is praising the artist by saying, when I look at your vase, I can hear the sounds. So vivid are the illustrations on your vase, because you've got the throaty turbo roar. I think we all know what that sounds like. The people are revving their engines of the hatchbacks, which is a kind of car. Joyful throb of UK garage, which obviously is a style of music, and house, another style of music imported from the continent. So this gives the poem a kind of modern glamour, doesn't it? The idea of it's not just any house music, but it's actually been imported from Europe. And the screech of tyres and squeals of girls. There's a nice verbal patterning there, isn't it? Screech of tyres, squeals of girls. There's a real frisson here, because it says nervous squeals of girls, too young to appreciate the peril they are in. So the sound imagery there, I think, makes you think of the girls both kind of excited and nervous about being in these cars, and they are too young to quite appreciate the peril they are in. I heard that these wheels will not lose traction, skid, flip, no harm will befall these children. So there's a comforting safety described in the poem, and what he means by that is these young people are frozen in time. When you look at Grayson Perry's urns, it's got pictures of these young people in these cars. They're safe forever because they'll never have a crash. because they're captured in that artistic moment. So you've got all of these sounds, and you've got all this vernacular language again about the music and skid and flip. But then right in the middle, again, you've got this much more formal Latinate language, which means to draw out. So all the way through, he's mixing vernacular and then Latinate formal language, which again links together these time periods and different poems and artists. In Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, in his second stanza, he talks about a moment when she cannot fade. So the idea that a woman who's pictured on the vase will remain beautiful forever. So Turnbull mirrors the structure in terms of the subject matter of Keats's Urn as well. And this continues into the third stanza because Keats and Turnbull in their third stanza focus on sex. And in Turnbull's cases, they focus on drugs as well. But Keats in his Now this is slightly different to Keats's fourth stanza, but there is a link. In Keats's fourth stanza, he talks about a scene of sacrifice and a deserted town while this sacrifice is taking place. And Turnbull here talks about not anyone being sacrificed, but he talks about the young people kind of lining up almost in a procession to watch the young people in their cars. And he mirrors the idea of the dead, deserted town. So there is a link here. Both of them open with this kind of imperative, now see, they kind of command that you look. Who comes to line the sparse grass verge? And he talks about the spectators toasting the car riders in Buckfast and Diamond White, which is a really cheap alcohol, and again considered low class. You know, the opposite of your fine champagne that they might toast things in at Formula One. And again, derogatory terms to talk about the young men, mainly, I think, who are lining up here, rat boys and cornrow cheerleaders. So he paints these young people as fairly kind of pathetic because he describes them in such a way that their only function is to cheerlead somebody else rather than do something useful themselves. And he talks about how they urge them, the car riders, to do things. Again, we've got this use of vernacular here, words that are from the lexis of these people who drive in these kind of cars. And whilst this imagery is really dark, talking about bleached tarmac and dead suburban streets, it's probably the toughest stanza in the poem, in the sense that he's speaking to you in a tough voice and wanting to actually effect some change, because this is social commentary. It's talking about how peace in your street, the right to peace and quiet at home, is only for people who can afford it. Curtains twitch as pensioners and parents telephone the cops to plead for quiet, sue for peace. Tranquility, though, is for the rich. So Keats' deserted town also mirrors this idea that only really the rich and privileged can afford literal peace, a quiet street to live in, but also peace of mind. And this is probably the heart of the poem. We're thinking about what's beauty, what's truth, who says to say what's a valuable activity and what isn't, but also the idea of who's to say how you should live your life and whose job is it to make other people's lives better. Now, in the last stanza, we go back to the kind of sarcastic tone of the first stanza, and the poetic voice goes back to insulting the vase. He calls it a garish crock. So a crock is a word for a cheap or sometimes broken piece of pottery, and garish, as you know, means too brightly coloured. And he talks about now what will happen in the future when there are no galleries left and we don't know the context of anything. So just like we've misunderstood what Grecian urns are, they weren't meant to be objects of art, they were everyday things. He says someday someone will misunderstand this Grayson Perry urn. Future poets will look on you amazed. And he says that this will happen after we're dead, when we're long in the box. So he uses this euphemism here to kind of lighten the tone, because he's talking about a time when he, the artist, and the reader will all be dead. And people will look on vases like Grayson Perry's and speculate how children might have lived, and they had lives free and bountiful beneath a sun a little colder. So there, obviously, we've got a reference to global warming and the idea that everything's always changing, and that we should perhaps carpe diem, seize the day, and appreciate the world that we live in now before it gets further destroyed. I like here the use of the word children. It gives a much more sympathetic, I think, tone to the people in the poem, which had previously been described as rat boys and geezers and girls. Here they're just called children, which is a much warmer way of describing them. And then he ends with a direct quote from Keats: how happy were those creatures then? And then he paraphrases, who knew that truth was all negotiable, beauty in the gift of the beholder. So he ends on musing what is art and truth and beauty, which is the essence of romanticism. So it's a really interesting poem. It deals with very colloquial, or if you like, low class topics, but elevates them to poetry, to beauty, to art, and in doing so also thinks about the passing of time and how time will affect us all. And it does that through a really fascinating mixture of vernacular language, but also a really tight structure and Latinate words which are much more formal. So a very, very clever poem, and a poem that really makes you think about who gets to define what is beauty and ultimately what is poetry.